tell you that fortunately for me, the adjustment to this completely online environment was not hard, in the sense that I was implementing a flipped classroom. Basically the design of the class was maintained exactly the same. The only thing that I did was to replace my physical classroom meetings by a Zoom live session. So in terms of assessment, I kept exactly the same as what I had originally in my syllabus, which was, formal assessments in ways of, midterm, final exam, some pop quizzes, and then the final project. The change was not big, but what was different was, I would say, the atmosphere and the feelings, because for everybody, not only for my students. So I had to come up with a good plan to support them beyond the formal aspects of the class, because of what everybody was going through. And that, of course, affected the way they perform the assessment. I tried to come up with reflections as much as possible. Usually what I do, before any formal assessment is, I put them in charge of a review. For example, they are divided into groups. They have to come up in class. That is an in-class work. They don't have any preparation for that, but they have to come up with, I use a lot of, digital tools. So they come up with a practice, and beyond practicing, beyond giving the chance to each group to practice with their classmates, I think that the most important part for that is the reflection or metacognition aspect that comes later, which is, okay, this is a practice that you created. Why? How is it that you as a group came up with this amount of vocab, with this structure, with this specific verbs, for example, with this specific aspects of the culture that we're supposed to evaluate in the formal assessment? Explain us why you believe as a group that the rest of your of the classmates, are going to value that, how it is important for them, and share learning strategies, share experiences. So I think that I usually do it in the classroom. I did it more when we switched to online. And I think that had a very, very positive sense of, support. It generated more support. So when the official assessment came, students, felt much better about it.
So I always love that question about assessment, because I try to mix up my assessments. I try to have where students use the language, and so where they will produce something. So maybe it's a little short story, maybe it's a little brochure or something like that. So in past years, they might have turned it into a physical form, but a couple of years ago, I switched to more digital. So with the pandemic, I was like, oh, okay, it doesn't change all that much. Where it impacted more is the quizzes, because I like to do regular quizzes. It keeps them a little bit more accountable for things. I know research has shown that quizzes are pretty powerful. And I was using a program called Plickers, where it has little QR codes and they hold it up and you scan it with your phone. It's fabulous because it does a lot of the work for you on quizzes. When I went remote, it was like, oh, how am I going to do that? Because it's going to be a lot more difficult to monitor and navigate. So in the spring, I actually backed off from the quizzes and didn't worry about any of them. This past semester that we're finishing now, and I was online as well. I mean, I do asynchronous in the most part. And Plickers came along with it and gave us an option to do it for us remote. And I was like, oh, fabulous. Thank you. They fixed the problem for me. I think if I had one advice would be don't be so focused on the assessment that you're stressing over it and you forget the teaching element of it. We're constantly assessing our students. Anything that we do when we're seeing them, we can tell what we're doing. So really the formal assessments, they're more to put a grade on something. It's more for administrations, for record keeping, that sort of things. So you have more leeway than you probably realize it. It's just a question of thinking outside the box and just don't talk about it. If you're like, oh, admin might have an issue with it, you just kind of, I mean, that's been my approach and it's worked. I don't necessarily say much about it and just like wait till they ask questions. They don't have time to look at the nitty gritty of it. So with the remote, give yourself grace, make it easy. Don't overburden yourself with like, oh, I have to do all of those things and then I have to hand grade that and it's difficult to keep up with it. No, look a lot at the easy thing. Can they do it? Are they doing it? Can you do a pass fail on it? And then the bigger chunks where it's more meaningful and go with that.
Yeah, I think that prior to the pandemic, I had been using conversations as a way of assessing interpersonal communication, but I hadn't really thought intentionally about ways in which those kinds of conversations in which I wasn't present, but I might listen to a recording or watch a video after the fact, might be used as kind of integrated assessments across all three modes. And so could I use a conversation with a native speaker to look at a student's interpretive skills? Could I use a conversation to assess their presentational skills? And so I worked on finding texts that could sort of form the basis of a conversation. So maybe if the topic is on vacations, they might read the same article about vacations and how the pandemic has affected travel, and then talk about that article, make comparisons, and maybe sort of elaborate on their own experience. And so in those instances, I did prompt our partners to be prepared to give a longer descriptive sort of account of a vacation than maybe that they would have normally given in a conversation, to be able to ask our students to go back and reflect on what they heard and how they interpreted the description of their partner.
In general, you know, my course design has to do with key elements and key frameworks that always guide me in everything I do. Flipped classroom would be the first one, and then the second thing would be backwards design, which is, you know, very helpful for me because as soon as I know the learning outcomes, then I can come up with a set of activities, tools, and assessments that really help students in order to, you know, to show that they learned, to show that they were able to achieve those learning outcomes. But in my case, the transition was smooth. I didn't have to adjust the process at all. But I know, you know, that many of my colleagues, you know, rely on, and all of us, I wouldn't say, yeah, that I'm not part of it. We rely sometimes a lot of on a lot of the organic things that happen within the classroom. And of course, the transition to an online environment make us as educators calculate much more because we cannot rely on that. We don't have it anymore. We have a space that we share, but it's not the same. It's different. So, you know, I know that for many people, the change was a little bit hard, you know.
Since the pandemic, a little bit more, because I'm being a lot more deliberate with it. I understand that we don't cover nearly as much ground. And I understand that, you know, it takes a lot longer to get through anything when you're doing it online. So I've been more deliberate with it. I've been paying attention to what's going to get them most bang for their buck. also, cheating is always a big, big, big concern for everybody. And that's why I've always liked the projects, because it's a lot harder to cheat. So with that in mind, I make sure that I really emphasize to them, like, okay, you could look it all up on Google Translate and plug it all there, but I'm going to see it. But we definitely have that understanding. I think that's probably what changed the most, that I'm even more deliberate as far as that, so that they understand it's not the accuracy, it's what I can do and the risks I'm willing to take. For instance, one project I do with my first semester, because they have a chapter with body and health and whatever. So I tell them, I'm like, okay, you are interviewing for a job at a fitness center and they want a 2-minute demo of a class you could lead. Go. You don't have to be on camera. You can have other people, do the sport for you or whatever you want to do, but you have to be narrating it. So for something like that, I expect, because of the topic, that they will use, body parts, but they might use commands if it comes through that. They're going to have, how are they going to be able to express their thoughts? And I'm looking more at that and more at, there was a variety, right? They didn't just tell me, oh, you have to do this, and I'm just going to count it down, because that's a novice, true novice, a novice low skill. At this point, I'm expecting a little bit more. So maybe I'll have, raise your arm, lower your arm. Okay, I've got a couple of things. So I'm looking more, what risk are you willing to take? How much of variety is it? Is it the same thing over and over and over again? Or is there a bit of variety where you tried, even if you failed, it's okay. And really at the end, when my overall evaluation is, okay, so we had, everything was super accurate, so they obviously got it, or, well, not quite so much, but it's within the spectrum of that. So that's what I focus more on. So yes, there is a bit of focus on something specific, but at the same time, it's like, show me what you can do, like dazzle me with your language. It starts with how we develop our course. So when we go to backward design, then we're looking at the end of this, my students will be able to do that. And I need to give them the tools to determine all of that. So when we get to the end, they truly are able to do it. And what I'm going to give them as an assessment is going to show that they are able to do that. So I think when we approach it that way, we're able to design some assessments that are more meaningful for the student, because they know, okay, what we're doing is going to be important. It is important every little bit. I'm just not having to go through these motions for maybe doing it, maybe not, and then it's gone. So I think that's one way to approach it. And then look at, what are students interested in? What do they like to do? Because if we're giving them something that they have no interest in, and like, okay, you're going to create this one project and you're going to do this, or we script it very closely, then they're like, okay, what's the fun? Why don't you do it? You seem to enjoy it so much. But if we're giving them, we say, okay, you're going to do a podcast and you're going to talk about, maybe the topic of the class, whatever we've been working on, that's what you're going to talk about on your podcast. And I just have, 2 requirements. It has to be 5 minutes long. The episode has to be 5 minutes long in target language. And you have to have 1 or 2 guests or whatnot. And then you let them go. And it's terrifying for the students, but they get so much more out of it. And we get to see so much more of what they've learned.
When I used to look at assessments, I used to keep in mind the objectives, but the design itself, I feel, was a lot more segmented into, here I'm going to look at the vocabulary, and here I'm going to look at the oral performance, and here I'm going to look at their writing. And over the past semester, I think I've really tried to think about a way to focus on what we're talking about and bring it all in to something a little bit more holistic. So I'm actually sort of in the throes of that process right now of redesigning all of my exams for the next term and thinking about if there's a way that I can better do this to make it a little bit more integrated for the student, which I think is making it harder for me. But the exams are a lot more fun. And I showed them preliminarily to a colleague who said, well, these are starting to look a lot more formative than evaluative. And so I'm trying to go back now and think, is that true, and is that okay? And also, you know, sort of transforming my old assessments into really low stakes practice kind of tests for my students. So I haven't thrown anything away, but I'm finding that I am more and more changing things that used to be more based on specific skills. And I'm leaving those for the students as ways to prepare. But my assessments themselves are becoming a lot more kind of open-ended, I guess, experiential activities. So if we're talking about planning a trip, I want them to go through the process of planning the trip. If we're talking about ordering at a restaurant, I want them to go through the process of looking it up and finding out how to get there. And so anything that would be preparatory might stay sort of, you know, what are your favorite restaurants and what are appropriate dishes to order? Those things are all staying sort of in the practice test, but they're not part of my actual exam anymore. So hopefully my colleagues won't kill me when they see some kind of radical changes in the way that the actual exams are being set up.
In general, my formal assessments are via the LMS. So they will have to, you know, complete certain tasks within the LMS to assess the 4 skills. And usually, what I do when I have a physical classroom is to work in the class, in the physical classroom, in one session, and come up with a prompt where they have to, write about it, impromptu, and I make that part of my formal assessments, midterm and then the final, right? So those 2 instances were not able to happen this semester, but you know, it was easy because I just put the prompts in the LMS, and that was it. You know, they did it anyway. All in all, it was writing, you know, and it didn't make any different in the performance or in the structure of the original assessment. So that was the only adjustment that I had to do.
So what I've added, because with the remote environment, it makes it sometimes a little bit more difficult to give them as much time for them to use language or to even get that input that they desperately need. So in my assessments, you know, and you get your summative, you have your formative. So I try to have like more of the formative type thing where they really practice. So that's where I use technology like Edpuzzle or Flipgrid, because they're having the comprehension area with the input. Flipgrid, they're doing it out there. It's giving them that. They might have that practice because they're going to do it. Oh, I didn't like it. Let me do it again. Oh, I didn't like it. Let me do it again. Right. So I give them that. And then in the summative part, then I try to also integrate a little bit more, but maybe not as much as I might have in past, where they have to listen to something to fully, you know, pull from it. But I'm more aware of, like, I have that balance that I absolutely need to have and be conscious of. We have to think outside the box a little bit. And it does take a little bit more time. And that's sometimes that might be the biggest danger, because we are so pressed for time. University level, we've got a little bit more leniency in that regard than K through 12. but we all have various things to develop and all of that. And that's where collaborating with colleagues is important, because, and you can collaborate across languages. I know one of my best partners in crime teaches Spanish, but we do things all the time. We're like, oh, let's do this. Okay, we'll do it in one language, then we transpose it into the other, and ta-da, we have it. It's super easy because one does it, the other one looks at it, and we've just split the problem in two, so we don't have to fully create it. And then we have the other person's eye too, who might catch a mistake or something else. So that's also pretty helpful. So hopefully, that's what it takes for people to have colleagues who want to work with them. But sometimes it's not in the same school. Sometimes you can be in different areas of the country, just have a similar philosophy, work on something similar and work together. That helps a lot as well.
The only major change I had to make mid-semester, because we had switched to remote teaching, was their final project. I was teaching a 4th semester language course, and the project is about going out in our city, we're in Dallas, and choosing a specific aspect of culture like food or architecture, health, engineering, and to find some tie with the target language culture and present how it's available in our city. So if there is an architect, if there's a company that has a base in the city, so students would choose one area and they would really develop ties, either visually or linguistically or commercially, between our city and the target language culture. Obviously with the pandemic, that wasn't possible anymore. And so we found professionals who were willing to be interviewed about how their sector had been affected by the pandemic. And then the students compiled all of their projects together into one video project where they presented kind of what is the state of whatever the field may be in the host country that they were looking at. And so that was actually, they loved that project. I think it was probably even more important for them than what the original project would have achieved, in part because this was the spring semester. And so the United States was actually in a much better position at that time than Europe was. And my students were talking to people working in Italy who were very heavily affected at that time. Whereas we weren't even sure if spring break was going to be canceled yet. And so students at the end of the course commented that they had had a very different perspective on kind of the development of the pandemic and its effects than their peers, because they were talking to people in Italy who had been affected before we really were experiencing those same things ourselves.
I would say the same. I would say the same amount of assessments, and I'm including both formal and informal. I didn't touch at all the syllabus, my plan at all. But when it came to the live sessions, I think that I had a feeling that I was missing that in-class contact, and I felt that I had to make sure that they feel okay, not only in terms of the acquisition of whatever content we were working with, but also in terms of the class itself. So I would say that informal assessments came much more frequently and in a much more calculated way, because that was the only thing that helped me really fill the gap, of not having the physical space.
I'd rather them get the practice. I know we had a shortened semester, so we had, I think, 13 weeks. We still covered 10 chapters that we had to in the textbook we had, so that was still a lot. And typically, I might have given them a small project at the end of each chapter, and in the course of 13 weeks, they did 3, potentially 4. Because I think I ended up cutting one out because it was like, oh, we're a little bit behind. You've got other things going on. Let's just cut that one out and move on. Just enough so they could try something that was different every time and they could feel the progression in their language abilities.
I'm finding that I'm giving assessments more frequently, but with much less weight. And so, I feel like students, there's been a lot of talk about being really flexible, increased sensitivity to the fact that we're all under pressure, and the idea of maybe cramming for an exam is, worse now than it ever was before. But I also feel like students really appreciated kind of the daily practice of having to do something, even if it was small. And so that's what I really tried to do. If it was just, one tiny interaction that I wanted them to do every day, that was going to be more important all of a sudden than maybe a weekly deadline. So if there used to be a big weekly writing assignment in the form of a journal or a blog or an interview with someone, I really tried to break that down into some kind of daily assignment. Go find, a Twitter post that relates to this topic. And then today I want you to find, a couple images on Instagram that relate to the same topic. And the third day, and so it was just breaking things down into a lot lower stakes assignments that forced them to stay on task, but also to be interacting daily. I think that was probably a shift that also should stay or will stay a component of the class.